Here we are on the seafront at Swanage, by the big beach as it was called in those days, the main Swanage beach, where in 1940, during the war, the Germans were coming over to this coast to bomb and make general mayhem on the coast. Anne was being driven along here in her pram by an aged aunt when a German plane literally came along the road, machine gunning along the road. There was a woman with her who decided that she would go for the glass shelter, which is where this shelter now is, to get away from the bullets. The aunt with Anne, who wasn't so bright, decided to stay where she was. And the woman was shot up in the shelter, but Anne was saved because she stayed on the road. So Anne is still with us. That's the story here. Here we are at the fun fair, which we used to come in the evenings for entertainment, Anne and Jane and I, and usually my father, just to look on to see what was going on. We weren't allowed in there, it was a den of iniquity, but there were all sorts of things like pinball machines, horse racing, you name it. And we used to stand in the street and watch and just entertain ourselves by looking. But we weren't allowed in there. And next door was a 40s ice cream parlour, which used to sell the most delectable things like Knickerbocker Glories, but again, I was never allowed to have one. Here is the ice cream shop, which was run by a man called Mr. Fete, an Italian, which during and just after the war was full of the most delectable things like Knickerbocker Glories and other great things, but we were never allowed to have them. Again, all we could do was look. They were regarded as too expensive and anyway rather common and sort of nasty things that ordinary people ate that we weren't allowed to eat. I'm now walking across towards Institute Road and the Malum, which was in those days, and this is now in the 1940s and 1950s, the major place of entertainment in Swanage, with nightly shows, pantomimes and things like that. We used to come occasionally. I'm now looking up Station Road, where on the right, above a chemist's shop, my two aunts, who were sisters of my grandfather, Aunt Mab and Aunt Elma, used to live. And we used to go out onto their balcony to watch the Swanage Regatta processions. That's when we were here for some holidays. And down here is Institute Road, along the end of which was my grandfather's shop. I'm now standing outside the Malum Institute, looking across towards Station Road and the Institute Road where they intersect. And on this corner, a little alleyway outside the bank, my grandfather used to stand most mornings, having walked down here from the cottage during his retirement, to catch up with the local gossip. He'd stand there leaning on his walking stick, chattering to people going past, and it was his way of keeping communications up with the locals that he knew when he had his shop. After he'd been there for say half an hour or so, he would go on along Institute Road to the Rose Cafe, where he'd have a cup of coffee, and we would join him quite often for coffee and sticky buns. Before we get there, I can point out what was then a lovely bookshop called Hill and Churchill, where I used to go in and look at yachting books and things like that, and where I suspect my grandfather bought me my first Arthur Ransom book. I'm standing outside what used to be my grandfather's shop. He came here in 1922 to take over from his father, and they used to sell carpets and other sort of soft furnishings here. They lived over the shop, and my mother used to live here with her sisters before she got married. And this is where, at the back, up a spiral staircase, he also had a place where he sold entomological supplies, butterfly nets, pins, books on natural history and so on. Really his main interest was natural history, but he had to keep the shop going to keep the family in finance. I'm standing outside what used to be the butcher's shop run by Mr. Vi, and you can still see the stone slab outside where he used to go in. And further up, about 200 yards up the street, is what used to be the main grocer's, Robson's, where a man called Mr. Budden used to carve cheeses and ham and so on, and we as children used to stand fascinated looking at him. My mother used to phone up or come in with a list of things she wanted to order, and they would then be put in the van and delivered back to the cottage later in the day. Opposite me here on this far corner is what used to be the Trocadero restaurant, the prime restaurant in Swanage in the 1940s and so on. It's now been all sorts of things like old clothes shops and so on, and never seemed to have made a success. But it was here Jo, my Aunt Jo and her Uncle John, my Uncle John, were married in 1940, and I remember being at their marriage feast and being told to keep quiet because I was apparently standing up at the back and shouting. Yeah. We're now walking across in front of the Trocadero, past what used to be an area where there were what we called spit shelters. They were in fact the toilets, public toilets. It's now been made into a neat and tidy open space with chairs and so on, but it was really pretty run down when we were here. I'm looking out towards the pier where the steamers from Bournemouth used to dock in the paddle steamers to take you to and from Bournemouth and the Isle of Wight, and looking out towards the old quay which was built to take the ships or the lighters that loaded stone to take out to the ships that really made Swanage its fortune in the 1850s. There's still the remains of a railway running along the stone quay here that used to carry coal, I think, for the ships out towards the quay. We're going to walk along the parade, so-called parade, which on the left has rows of boarding houses. And my sister Anne and I used to wander along here looking in the front windows, watching the people having their breakfast and making silly remarks about the fact that they had Coleman's mustard on the table and things like that. And along here I remember one day a man hung up a huge fish he'd caught, which was actually a sea bass, which in those days was a major catch. Now of course is quite common and commonly eaten in fish restaurants and so on. In those days was quite a rare find. This strange monument, which looks like a cannon up standing on its end with cannonballs on top, is in fact a complete anachronism. It's erected by the Swanage identity John Malham in 1862 to commemorate the great naval battle in Swanage Bay between Alfred the Great and the Danes in AD 877, by which time of course cannonballs hadn't even been thought of, let alone cannon. So it's a complete anachronism, but it is a very nice memorial saying that there was a major sea battle here in medieval times. It's fairly typical of Swanage not getting their facts quite right.